we will make a start. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our second Basis Wednesday webinar. Very, very pleased to welcome back. A lot of you were with us last week, but we've also got quite a few people who joined us for the first time today. So thank you for returning, but also thank you to those new joiners. We really have been heartened by the response that we've had. We've got, like I say, more people this week, and we hope that we just continue to build. So please do let your colleagues know. These are intended to be interactive sessions. We want you to speak to the group if you're happy to. So to do that, go down to the bottom of the screen and click on participants, and then please raise your hand. We did have a few people waving at us last week. It's difficult to spot everybody on the screen. So if you do an electronic raise hand, so click on participants, and then you should be able to raise your hand. Somebody's already practicing. Ewan, do you actually want to say something? We'll come back to that. So do an electronic raise your hand. You are all muted at the moment. So when we ask you to speak, if you've raised your hand, when we ask you to speak, please unmute yourself. Say what you need to say. But please do mute yourself when you finish, just to avoid any sort of background noise. Also, we want to encourage use of the chat feature. So again, down at the bottom, you've got the chat. So type in anything, any relevant comments you want. As best we can, we'll introduce those into the questions and conversations. So there's two ways. You can actually speak to the group, or you can come into the chat and ask us some questions that way. So there's multiple intentions behind these sessions. First and foremost is that we're trying to provide a service to you, the sports community in the UK, at this kind of crazy, odd, uncertain time. But it's also about driving sustainability to the heart of our response to this current crisis, and making sure that the positive aspects are emerging, are actually taken forward, and that sport actually emerges from this much more resilient economically, socially, environmentally. And yesterday, the chief execs of the English Football League, the RFU and the ECB sat in front of the Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee in UK Parliament on the inquiry into the impact of COVID-19 on sport. And they did paint a troubling economic picture moving forward, and a quite uncertain short and medium-term future for sport. Just this morning, the Committee on Climate Change sent a letter to the Prime Minister and senior cabinet ministers advising on how climate policy can, and I would say must, play a part in building a resilient recovery from this COVID-19 crisis that we're currently in. And we're hoping that within the next few weeks, we're going to have Lord Deben, the chair of the Climate Change Committee, actually participating in one of our sessions. Look, these two things are linked: the issues that we've got moving forward with sport, but also this emergence from this with a much more positive economy. They're much more linked, and we've got to come out of this drawing those positives together. I think there's a growing feeling globally, both socially and politically, that a sustainable response to this crisis has to be, this is an opportunity to do that, and this has to be a catalyst towards that more sustainable future. And I think it's tangibly different to that 2008 financial crisis. And sport really does have a clear role to play. There are a lot of people with concerns about sport at the moment, but it's such a socially cohesive participation that we have to move forward through this. We have to formulate a response. So that's what these sessions are all about. Today we're talking about communicating sustainability. So you've heard enough from me. Welcome again, and I'm going to hand over to Dom Goggins to take this session. Dom is the Communications Director of Basis. I'll hand over to Dom.
Thanks, Russ. Hi, everybody. Just to reiterate, Russ's thanks to you all for joining us. Last week was a great discussion. It was our first one. We were really heartened by it. It's great to see so many of you back and so many new faces as well. We've got a summary actually of last week's conversation for those of you who weren't able to take part. If you like it, just email info@basis and we can send it out to you. There was also an article in The Guardian last Wednesday which included a bit of a summary of our conversation by Tanya Aldred, and we'll post the link to that in the chat so you can view that as well. But it's really good to see so many great organisations and great people on. We've got some big governing bodies like the FA, the ECB, the RNA, got Formula One with us. We've got some big football clubs like Leeds United. We've got some big cricket clubs like Warwickshire. We've got a massive contingent from Scotland. That's a new thing for us, but you're all very welcome. We've got broadcasters. We've got some real experts in sustainability, and we've got some British level athletes as well. So thank you to everybody for joining. A really strong sentiment that came out of last week's discussion was that while this is obviously a terrible and really tragic situation and crisis that we find ourselves in, it's a real reckoning of sorts about the way that things work, and that if sport is going to undergo the big shift on sustainability, the big shift in which sustainability moves from the sidelines to the centre of the pitch, that this really could be the turning point. And that while this crisis will impact the way that we talk about sustainability, perhaps this pause gives us an opportunity to think about, how we message these issues and how we try and engage the whole sporting community on issues around the environment, sustainability and climate change, and maybe tell a bit of a better story. So that's the spirit in which we are running today's session. We're going to do a little bit on the basics of decent communication, but we're not going to delve into that because this isn't like a comms workshop. It is an open discussion. And if we were going to do a comms workshop, I wouldn't be the right person to do it. There are other people on this call who will be better placed to. What we are going to do is look at the context for communicating about sustainability in sport and how that context might be affected or changed by the crisis that we are currently living through. I've got a couple of slides. I'm going to talk for probably about 10 minutes, and then it's over to you and the floor will be yours. I'm just going to try and share my screen. So here is the first opportunity for a meltdown. Is that working? I think that's working. My word, it's working. Okay, so just quick, a few basic principles on how you communicate, or the best ways to communicate to try and get your message out there. I think the first is this is going to be nothing new to people who work in comms, but to try and understand who your audience is and try and identify what moves and motivates them. You have to start with your audience first. If you've got a message to put across, it might work for you, but you've got to understand how it's going to work for the people who you're trying to reach and you're trying to influence. The second thing is to understand exactly what you're trying to say, boil it down really to the basics. And the third is to try and combine those two by making a connection. Often using stories or analogies or images or metaphors can be a really useful and easy way to do that. And I think just a message specifically for people who work in sustainability is don't make the amount of really complicated stuff that you know about a barrier to helping people who don't necessarily understand that complexity to kind of really get the message that you're talking about. And I just want to use an example from technology, not from sport, as to a piece of communication which really used all of these different principles and worked. And it was the original iPod. 2001, 19 years ago. I don't know about you, that made me feel pretty old when I was looking it up today. The engineers of the original iPod were really excited that there was a 5 gig hard drive, that there was Firewire connectivity, that there was all this syncing stuff that you could do that could never have been done before, and all using a 1.8 inch drive. The problem with that is that that's only going to be exciting to the people who engineered the iPod. It's not really going to mean anything to the public who Apple wanted to buy the iPod in the numbers that they did. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to remember, and it's probably not the right format for a shout, but how they packaged it in a way that was relatable to the audience that they were trying to reach was a very, very simple, 1,000 songs in your pocket. And that, to us, might not seem like a particularly groundbreaking thing now with all the mobile technology that we've got, but at the time it was an absolute game changer. And it was a way that was a real encapsulation of all of these principles in a way that made the iPod wildly and absurdly successful and transformational. So they're just a few basic principles, and we can come back to them if you like. But if your organisation is thinking about how to communicate your sustainability programme, BASIS can help you. So do get in touch with us and we'll help you boil that down. I think just looking now at the specific context for communicating on sustainability issues within sport in particular, if you look at it before all this started, before this crisis started, public concern about climate change, public support for action on the environment and for tackling the big issues related to the environment and for becoming more sustainable was at an all-time high before all of this kicked off. And that's really significant because that, as you can see from 2013, that support for action on climate change has grown significantly and it has grown consistently. It's very, very solid. It continues to grow. So your starting point you're in a positive place. This concern, this commitment is increasingly having an influence on the choices that we make, our behaviours, our purchases. Just a few examples, more than half people polled by YouGov consider sustainability, environmental sustainability of a product to be a real factor in the choices that they make about purchasing food and drink, very relevant to big sports venues. Particularly for younger people, so Generation Z and millennials, but obviously core audiences for a number of sports and desirable audiences for sports who haven't quite penetrated those age groups yet. 61% think it's important for a company to have a purpose and to take a stance on issues that matter. And in terms of the issues that matter, 71% of the same group consider climate change to be the defining challenge of their generation. Obviously, this was before COVID, but it was only just before COVID. And it was significantly higher than the next most pressing issue for these groups of people. Incidentally, the same groups of people do not particularly trust the government to take the amount of action that will be sufficient to be able to solve these problems. They want to see action coming from everywhere, and particularly from the organisations with which they engage. So this might only be relevant to the economy, you could say, but it is actually directly relevant to sport, partly because when it comes to brand identity, people identify much more with the sports teams and the brands that they support, that they have an affinity with, more than they do with kind of, day-to-day businesses. And there isn't much data about this, but this I thought was a really interesting graphic on a great piece of work that was done by our friends over at Sports Positive Summit, along with the BBC on sustainability in Premier League football. There was a poll. There were over 20,000 people who were surveyed by the BBC, and who responded to the poll. 83% of the people who responded said that it mattered to them how their football club impacts on the environment, and nearly 2/3 of those people said it mattered a great deal to them. So that's an overwhelming majority, and it is something that is directly relevant in sport. I think we need more of this data. I think it's something that hopefully we'll work on with BASIS, with a number of partners across sport, is to really try and drill down and understand what is moving and motivating fans when it comes to sustainability. But it's an issue that the public in general and that sports fans instinctively do care about and want to see their clubs, their teams, their governing bodies, their sports talking about. So now we come to COVID, and there's a kind of during and after this crisis. There are a couple of dimensions that we're going to have a quick look through. And I would say that we're learning all the time, and particularly in terms of how this crisis is affecting the stories that we tell and the way that people are receiving those stories right now. There are a lot of caveats, but there are a couple, I think, quite powerful pieces of data that have come out in the past couple of weeks. The first is that only 12% of people approve of the way that the Premier League and Premier League clubs have handled this crisis. And that compares to 29% for the government. Obviously, you would expect overwhelming support for the NHS, but I thought that the difference between the Premier League and the government was quite striking, given that we do have the highest death rate in Europe at the moment because of this crisis. 92% of people who were polled by YouGov believe that footballers should take a pay cut. And what's an alternative story for that? An alternative story for it is that, like every business at the moment, the Premier League and Premier League clubs are trying to work out how they can restart their operations. It would be ridiculous if they weren't, but the perception that Premier League clubs want to finish the season, I think, is leading to a conclusion that people are drawing, that it is insular, that football is insular and it only cares about itself. That's the wrong judgment to make, but in the vacuum around a positive story, that is the conclusion that's being drawn. So what is the positive story that could be told? Well, if you look, there are at least 2, and I think more Premier League football grounds at the moment that are effectively, they've been taken over by the NHS, and they are COVID-19 testing sites. That's a really positive story for football in actually dealing with this crisis that could be told, but it hasn't been told. It certainly hasn't been told in a way that has cut through to people. And in terms of footballers' pay, Premier League footballers make up less than 2% of the UK population that takes home more than £1 million a year in pay. Not every Premier League footballer takes home more than £1 million a year in pay. Obviously, it's an astonishing amount of money, but through the Players Together initiative, Premier League footballers have actually contributed millions of pounds to trying to deal with this crisis. But because they are so visible, and because the riches that flow through the Premier League are so sizable, football becomes an easy target. And the problem for sport is that while the Premier League isn't representative of the whole of the sports sector, it's the flagship competition of our national sport. So it is emblematic of something. The conclusion that I draw from this is that this is not an actual real problem. It's a problem of storytelling, which is why the narratives that you use, the way that you communicate, is really, really important, whether it's in a crisis or whether you're trying to get a more long-term, more positive message across. How does this affect us going forward? Well, the UK public is the least enthusiastic in the world of all of the major economies about ending the lockdown, certainly about ending the lockdown soon, of all of the G20 economies, that is. Of the things that make the public nervous about coming out of the lockdown, watching sport, going to watch sport in person, which was a national pastime and characteristic before this crisis, is top of the list. Nearly 70% of people who were polled who normally go and watch sport don't feel comfortable with the idea of going to do it soon anyway. I think people are getting used to the idea that we're not going to be watching live sport in packed football stadiums or packed cricket grounds or packed rugby stadiums for a long time, or for quite a long time. Of the other things that the public are anxious about, more than 90% now are either quite concerned or very concerned about long-term public health, and 86%, so nearly the same amount, about the impact of this crisis on the economy. So what does that tell us? It tells us that the issues that we're talking about, when it comes down to sustainability, the environment, public health, finances, are very, 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 very present in people's minds. That people believe instinctively that we need to make progress on these issues, and that sport is part of that, and they want to see their clubs, their teams, the brands that they associate with responding to that and showing that they're making progress. Sport right now has some challenges, both in terms of the way it is perceived in this crisis and also how it can recover quickly coming out of the crisis. And as I said, that this has put the issues that we talk about as sustainability advocates or practitioners or people who are interested into the sharpest possible focus. There are a few other things going on as well. There are some shifts taking place in public opinion. And the reason I'm talking about the public, there are people on this call whose audience actually is, like a group of senior executives, because you're a sustainability practitioner within a club or within a venue, and you need to get your management to do something. There will be people who are parts of comms teams who need to appeal to the public. There will be people who are working in academic circles who will have an academic audience. I'm choosing the public because that's the big audience that we all have. And ultimately, if you're looking at the power that sport has, its reach, its cultural influence, it's because of the way in which it resonates with the public. More than half of the public said that they've noticed and they value cleaner air since lockdown began. There's been a massive increase in people who notice the wildlife around them. People are more in tune with environmental issues on a day-to-day basis than they've ever been. Combine that with the commitment that is consistent in the public about the need to tackle climate change, and that's a powerful mix. There's been a 40% increase in the number of people who feel a stronger sense of their local community and who feel more in touch with the family, the friends, and the people around them. So bonds, at least so far in this lockdown, have been strengthening. And 48% of people have said that they actively want to see climate change tackled with the same urgency as COVID-19. Now, 48% is, I mean, if you look at the referendum, it's a losing percentage, but it's actually a significant percentage in this context because of the word urgency, the same urgency as COVID, because of the scale of the response to this, unprecedented in nature. That's quite a powerful statistic. And the thing I think, which is, I think most powerful of all, is that despite all of the anxieties and all of the concerns that this crisis has visited on people and that people are feeling, only 9% of people polled want to go back to life as it was before this crisis started. And I think you put all of that together and you've got quite a powerful mix. Now, none of us know where this is going to end. We don't know exactly how sport is going to emerge from this crisis. I think a large number of people on this call believe that sustainability should be at the heart of sports comeback or re-emergence. We do know that things will be different, and I think my message is that in that difference is our opportunity and the way that we tell our stories about how connected we as a sports community, in whatever capacity you are, your club, you as an individual, how connected we are to the world around us, how connected we are to the community, and how committed we are to playing that larger role could make a huge difference. So that's basically it in terms of an introduction from me. The floor is yours, the discussion is yours. I'm going to pose a couple of questions which might help to guide the discussion. The first is an invitation really for you to share examples of pieces of environmental or sustainability communications, either within sport or outside of sport, that have impressed you, or if you were involved in them that you are particularly proud of, that you think that people can learn from. And any thoughts that you might have about how this crisis might change the way that sports, governing bodies, organisations, all stakeholders really, can engage people, can engage their audiences and their communities. But don't be restricted by these questions. Just, it's something that's there to stimulate discussion. And if you have any reflections on what you've heard so far, then it'd be interesting to hear them. But thank you, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dom. Really appreciate that. That's a really good summary of where we are and some of the responses that the public have been having to these issues. It's really, look, it is positive that people have expectations around sport, but clearly there are huge concerns. And like I said at the beginning, the purpose of these sessions is for you guys to actively participate in some kind of formulation of a response to this. So if anybody has any comments, any thoughts, be grateful if you would raise your hand. So yeah, Ewan, you're the first up. If you want to unmute yourself and let's hear what you say.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I think I work for Sport Scotland, which is the national agency up here. So I guess very similar in a lot of ways to Sport England and other national agencies. I think one of the things that we've probably noticed and we've come to realise now is that with all the negativity around the COVID situation, there's some positives to take from it as well. And I'm trying to think that the link here between the way we work going forward and some of the environmental and financial issues that have been raised. I think the fact that we're doing this session today online, we're not sitting in a lecture theatre somewhere, has showed the way that people have had to adapt over the last few weeks. And I think it's a really good opportunity for all of us to think about how we work more effectively. So, for example, I can see us going forward working with boards or working in teams and different groups, being able to do this more remotely over video conferencing call, etc. And I think the spin-offs from that one quite clearly are that people are going to spend less time on planes, people are going to spend less time in their cars driving across the country. And, you know, if you're in an environment where you're being paid travel expenses and so on and so forth, you know, you're actually cutting down on that kind of side of things as well. So there's a lot of stuff that's really, really serious going on just now. We all get that. But actually one of the benefits, I think, going forward then is the fact that, you know, it's a game changer in terms of our time, the way we engage. And I think there's a lot of positive spin-offs from that.
Yeah, completely agree. I think we've got fundamental changes across all business, certainly the way that sport runs is going to change. Clearly there are big issues around venues and participation sport, even community sport. How do we actually get people back and get those positive messages and encourage people back into those venues and into actually, you know, sport is all about contact, both on a personal level, but physical as well. So we've got to make sure that people are confident in those things. I think
there was a statistic I was going to include, but I didn't because I couldn't. I thought it might be useful for the discussion. To be fair, Ewan, it was a Sport England recent activity survey, but I wonder whether the figures are similar. Similar in Scotland, showing that more people are exercising on a daily basis than have been for a long time, and more people understand and value exercise, both in terms of physical and mental health, than ever before. Figures way over 60%, I think, and you know, as far as I'm aware, they've not really been seen before. And I think that's, you know, that's going to be encouraging in terms of, you know, awakening the idea of physical activity being a routine part of people's lives. Going forward, particularly if we can lock it in. But I think it rubs up against something which came up in last week's discussion, which was about how, as Russell just said, sport is like a social, and you know, it's a social thing. It's something that we do together, whether we watch or whether we play, and that trying to re-establish those kind of, you know, up close bonds of, like, particularly a team sport, a competitive sport, might be challenging. And actually, you know, if you look at the stat around social bonds improving, maybe there is an opportunity there for sports organisations, for, I don't know, it would be governing bodies or clubs or whatever, to kind of re-establish social bonds, but in a real way, in a way that actually involves contact. Because I think, you know, people exercising is great, but if everybody exercising on their own, then sport is going to lose out.
Do we have anybody else who'd want to make a comment at this point? Please remember, raise your hand, go down to the participants, and then it should pop up that you can raise hand. We have got a question that's come through, and maybe it is an open question to everyone, but maybe Dom, as our focus, you might want to jump in. But Lauren's actually just asked if, given what Ewan's just said about reduction in travels, etc., there's going to be a lot of bodies are going to actually be saving some money around this. How do we actually, and there's going to be big concerns financially. You know, most of the conversation recently from English Football League, ECB and RFU that was expressed at the parliamentary meeting just yesterday was about these costs. How do we actually make sure that this money actually goes back into a more sustainable approach, a more sustainable future, and positive knock-on effects for the environment? Anybody has any thoughts around that?
Well, I'm happy to kick off the discussion on that one. I guess I'll do it from a couple of perspectives. I think the first is about, so if you're a big venue, for example, let's use the example of a Premier League club, and you're putting on one event every fortnight to which 55,000 people are going to be travelling, then, like, because of the positioning of well, what should I use? I'll use the example that I'm most familiar with, which is Manchester City, because I'm a Manchester City season ticket holder. The infrastructure around Manchester doesn't really support that number of people travelling to one place all at the same time. And I've got where I live is about 20 minutes walk from the game, so I've got an air pollution monitor. I borrowed it from a friend at Friends of the Earth, and I took it on the route that I walked to the game for 4 consecutive home games, and every single one it breached the legal limit around air pollution. And normally that road on a day-to-day basis doesn't go anywhere near the legal limit. So there's a cost implication, absolutely. There's an environmental implication, and there is a direct impact on the people who are going to the game. So, the main stakeholders of the football club, if you think that fans still run football, the City supporters and the away supporters who are exposed to this level of air pollution. Now, City had started to respond to this by putting an initiative called Walk to the Match, where they've got guided walks from the city centre to the game, and there was some really good take up. It started in the autumn, and I think it would still be going on with the season still going. But I think that only is going to solve one bit of the problem, which is the people who are able to not drive and to walk, and who live close enough to the ground or whatever. I think that comes back to the question around purpose and people wanting to see the clubs that they support or the brands that they've got an affinity with or a relationship with stand up, because ultimately that's a conversation about infrastructure, and it's a political conversation. And there's a limit really to how far I think sports clubs are prepared to go in that conversation at the moment. Similar to clubs that are powered by renewable energy are reluctant to link it to climate change, because climate change is seen as a political conversation. I think there are a few bits in there which I think this could help to, this crisis coming out of it. I think we've got to look at these issues a little bit differently, and it could be a game changer.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. Sam, you've had your hand up just while Dom was talking. If you want to unmute yourself, please come in.
Hi everyone. So my name's Sam. I'm from an organisation called Planet Mark. What we do is we're an environmental organisation that help businesses to measure and reduce their carbon. And I think some of the points that have been raised already. People are talking about this has kind of given everyone an opportunity to realise that working remotely, using this technology, it does work. I think this one thing that we've always found problematic for companies is what we do primarily is we measure carbon footprints. And then, you take this to a company, it says, look, a big portion of your carbon footprint is the CEO flying back and forth across the Atlantic. There is a solution to this. And I think this opportunity to show people that it does work is going to have a really important impact. And there was another point, about, an increased participation in sport and an increased appreciation for it. And I think one thing that we can do and sports organisations can do is just, like I said, show their value, show their worth. And one way to do that and communicate it effectively is through measurement. And I think when you can show that data and say, we're contributing this value to society, this is how we've done it, I think people can really appreciate it and connect with you as a brand.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you for that, Sam. I guess one of the issues around sport as well is actually you will have to move around to participate, and clubs will have to move around to actually have their games. In terms of the organisation, the administration of sport, there's a huge amount we can do, but there's a big piece around how we actually administer fixtures and tournaments, etc. We do have a few people lined up. Ed, are you ready to chime in? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Russell, and thanks, Dom, for the presentation. My name's Ed King. I work with the European Climate Foundation based in London, and been involved in a few sport and environment reports over the past couple of years with Russell and Dom. I had kind of three bits to drop in, and I think Russell, the parliamentary hearings yesterday, I think really exposed the focus that so many clubs are going to have on their financial viability moving forward. And that's going to be a real challenge in terms of trying to sort of push the environment message and obviously keep many clubs, particularly in the lower leagues, afloat. I think in terms of the perception of more people doing sport, I certainly thought that was the case, but there was a poll out last week by Comres which suggested that's not the case. But it obviously looks like it's the case because there are people dressed in various forms of lycra jogging down our street at all times of the day. And I think that's interesting. I think that's a real opportunity, but given we all understand now how sport can aid mental health, how it's really important in terms of keeping us on a kind of level level sort of balanced lifestyles, particularly at this kind of time. And I think that could be a real opportunity, particularly when we understand now that obesity is a contributing factor to more deaths from COVID. So there's some obvious kind of parallels there. I think there are quite a few local infrastructure consultations going out right now from local councils across the UK relating to making streets safer for cycling and running, expanding areas for pedestrians, expanding greenfield areas. And I think those could be potentially areas where the sporting sector at large could get involved, given school playing fields have been disappearing at kind of alarming rates over the past couple of decades. That's potentially an area where messaging wise, sporting organisations and bodies can really get behind that. And the third piece is just echoing everything Don was saying about health. I think people are recognising, particularly in the centre-right media, which is interesting, the benefits of having clean air in cities. You can certainly notice it in London. And I think being able to talk about clean air and the ability to get out there and play more. Yes, you've got the transport concerns about sport, but I think that's a really strong area where the power of sport and the soft power of sporting bodies could really help accelerate that. And given I think it's something in the region of 40,000 premature deaths a year anyway, related to air pollution in the UK, that could be a really powerful and potent space for sporting bodies to get involved longer term.
Just quickly, Ed, thank you for those comments, and I wholeheartedly agree with all of them. Just a couple of quick responses, or just to build on what you were saying in terms of point one about the financial concerns that exist. I mean, I think within football it's been articulated, but it's across professional sport at the moment. There's, I think, a big opportunity to repackage sustainability as a financial imperative as well, because ultimately, if you're making environmentally sustainable choices, then over the long term, you're making financially sustainable choices as well. I appreciate that doesn't necessarily help in the current crisis, but I think there are ways through this crisis that can allow us to coin an emerging phrase to build back better. I think the second thing you were talking about infrastructure, and I think absolutely it is the business of people involved in sport to get involved in these conversations, and the extent to which they do, I think is, I think it's for each organisation to work out for themselves. But infrastructure can enable healthy, active lifestyles and enable the kind of lifestyle which is going to increase basically the base of people who are able to participate in sport, and therefore grow the size of the sports community even further, or it can inhibit that. And at the moment it inhibits it, and it does it in a way which creates things like air pollution and obesity crises, which tangibly make a situation like COVID that much worse. And I think just another point actually on the, I guess how much of an impact this is having in terms of finances demonstrates how ill-prepared sport is for disruption on any real scale, because actually sport hasn't been shut down for that long, and an awful lot of clubs and leagues are in real financial difficulty. And as well as the point that you can have a much more kind of economically long-term sustainable approach by being more environmentally sustainable, there is the flip side of that coin, which is sport is going to have to be prepared. Certainly sports that involve pitches or involve mountains or involve water, basically involve the things that are going to be affected by climate change. They're going to have to be more prepared for a greater level of disruption. There have been a couple of reports, the Game Changer report from the Climate Coalition, the Hit for Six report on cricket that you, Ed, were involved in, and that went out from basis, have both shown that, as of a number of examples from across professional sport the last couple of years. It's not going to be on the same scale. It's probably not going to be for as long. But if you are as a football club or a rugby club living from home match to home match, because that's the only way you can get the revenue to be able to make it to the next one, and there is a disruption because of extreme weather, because of different pressures that's created by climate change, then there's going to be a problem long term, and it's one that we can get in front of now.
Excellent, thanks both. I just wanted to pick up on one thing as well. We do have a couple of people waiting to speak, but just a quick question, and maybe either Ed or Dom. You mentioned about this people now being more active, actually taking time to start jogging, cycling, etc. And that helps with mental health and physical health. But there's almost a dichotomy here. I think that those people have picked up from a health perspective. You know, they've realised that there's this big crisis going on. They're much more aware of health. They've got much more time to be able to do these things. So is it messaging actually coming from sport? And is there an opportunity for professional sport to be talking to people more about health benefits when they can't actually access watching sport on TV, watching professional game? Or is it something sort of slightly different, that it needs to be from that participation level, that community sport level, to be talking to people about their health and about becoming more active? Where does that sort of messaging come from to encourage people? Any thoughts, Dom or Ed, if you want to jump back in?
I mean, where should it come from? Who should be the carriers of that message, or how can sport harness messages around public health or imperatives around public health?
It just feels to me that maybe this has happened spontaneously, and it's been a realization about health rather than in a vacuum of professional sport, rather than it being anything that sport has affected so far. And I think there's an opportunity for sport here to actually encourage that, and maybe it is something that sport needs to explore a bit more. But I just wonder, where does that actually come from? Is it a tangible, is it a meaningful message for it to come from a Premiership football club, from a first-class cricket club, or should it be coming from the local participation community type of organisation?
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think there's a answer to it. I mean, I think the obvious answer is it needs to come from everywhere. But I think ultimately this comes back to those first principles we were talking about in terms of its relevance to the way that sports engage with the public. It's about knowing where your audience is and understanding where your audience is. And if your audience, if the general public is more in tune with the concepts of the public health and their own individual health, and you know what contributes to positive health than they've ever been, then it's a good starting point to engage with them. And if your message is that with us you can become more active, with us you can become more inspired, with us your mental health will be much more resilient, then you know that's a decent communications mix there. The outcome is way beyond communications, but in order to be able to get people engaged in the first place, you've got to take that comms step. I mean, you know, my starting point with all this was nowhere near communications, and it's taken me years to learn that actually telling good stories is the way that you do engage and inspire people to think differently and to change their lives. And when you have a watershed moment like this that nobody expected, then it's incumbent on all of us, I think, to reflect on the way that we tell our own stories and the good that does, or the good that it prevents, basically. And I think now there is an opportunity for sport to reflect on that and to step up. I think there have been certain parts of the sports communities that have been doing it really well. As a whole, we could do a lot better. And as we've said a number of times, Russ, I think that's the kind of thing that we want to help basis to catalyse and to facilitate.
Brilliant, thanks. We do have a bit of a queue for people wanting to make some comments. I want to encourage people to actually put some comments on the chat as well. So please, if you've got any responses, any questions, please do come through. Pete, you've had your hand up for a little while. If you can unmute yourself and jump in.
Yeah, sure. It's Pete Watts. I work for a consultancy working in stadium operations. One of the things, just going back, touches on a couple of things on potential positive messaging. It goes back to something Sam was saying a little while ago. There is a chance at the moment, especially in venues and facilities, to actually collate a load of data about where baseline kind of figures are on consumption of water, power, your lighting, well, anything, because you've got a lot of venues have got this unique chance to be kind of like totally unactive, and which is never probably going to happen again, hopefully. And those kind of things, if you get that kind of data and start looking at those kind of things, that can then flip into a message for people about, okay, well, these are our kind of true consumption figures if we've just got this building here. Once we start layering on things, this is what the impact is of doing this and this and this on our kind of consumption. And those kind of stories then goes back to what Dom's saying, as in, you know, they're facts, that's tangible, that's not wishy-washy. Suddenly people like maintenance people and the kind of contractors who may be dealing with buildings have a load of data there which can actually be used in a very positive message to show what's happening in their venues and the impact that people have on using those venues, and how we can maybe therefore in the future control that a bit better because we got the actual information available.
Definitely. And there were a couple of comments just coming through on the chat as well that, you know, you can only manage what you measure. It's the old adage that we all know, but you're absolutely right, Pete. Chris, again, you've had your hand up for a while. If you would like to unmute and jump in.
Thanks, Ross. Hi, everyone. Also, hi to Ewan. We go back a long way. Mine's just, I'm from the Planet Earth Games. It's a small charity in Devon, and last year we held our first event, which was a multi-activity environmental themed event involving plogging, paddleboarding, connecting people to nature. Obviously we can't do that this year. Oddly enough, this crisis brings a small opportunity for us, because we've looked at things and we can go, people are talking about, a lot of people are running, a lot of people are cycling, so we're going to make our event virtual this year, so we can capture people upload their GPS data from their Garmin's and Strava and do their different events. And we plan to host it at the same time as when the Olympics was supposed to be, so go through the Olympic cycling, which I think is quite a strong way to go about it. And our call to action typically has been about getting active and getting engaged in environmental sustainability. My slight concern is that everything is selfish concerns. Everything is obviously about COVID. That's the number one. That's entered the number one at the charts, straight at number one. I'm a bit unsure about what the most effective call to action is around being active and the environment when COVID is clearly the number one priority all around. So I'd like to get Dom's take on that, and anybody else who wants to chip in, help us just get that strong, clear call to action for our program, really. Because we don't want we want to incorporate some assistance for the NHS or people that hit badly by COVID, but I don't want us to seem like we're ignoring that.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Dom, are you able to jump in on that one?
Yeah, Chris, you broke up a little bit when you're making your point. It sounds like you've taken some really interesting steps to continue to be active this year. And I've heard of your conversation before. I've heard of your initiative before. Just so I'm right, were you asking the question about how you can basically kind of communicate that you are active as an organisation and active on the environment while this crisis is happening?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, you know, you can start with the way that the public is responding to this as a decent starting point, and we can pick this up kind of offline. And if any other comms professionals on this call have got any thoughts, then that'd be great. But if the public are concerned about public health, about their own individual health and the health of the community around them, if they're connected to their community in new ways, if they want to see things work differently after the crisis than they worked before, then it's effectively showing how your initiative, your organisation helps to facilitate that or aligns with that. So I would find those pressure points. I would find those things that are really sticking out in all of the data about the way that the public is feeling about this crisis or feeling during it, to be able to build out of it in a way that is able to engage them. But one thing I'd say about this, obviously we're talking about COVID and it's a dominant context and will be for a long time. I'm not encouraging anybody to throw the baby out with the bathwater. A lot of this stuff is effectively going back to the things that were happening that were positive in this space anyway. Because when you're talking about longer term environmental sustainability, you are talking about public health, you are talking about financial resilience, and obviously you're talking about positive outcomes for the environment, as well as being able to awaken something, be it a greater connection with your organisation, your initiative, your competition, or a bit of an inspirational message about the fact that sport is bigger than, you know, all of us, and it is able to have a transformational impact. Like, you know, those things were true before this, and they'll be true for a long time after this. I think what we have now is the need to basically just tweak the way that we talk about it a little bit to be mindful of the things that people at the moment are really anxious about or really supportive of for the future. Does that make any sense? I mean, we'll talk about this later as well if it's useful, but does that make any sense?
Yeah, that'd be good. That's very helpful, Dom. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dom. Zena, you've had your hand up. If you'd like to jump in, unmute yourself.
Hi there, folks. So my name's Zena. I'm from the Extinction Rebellion Cricket Club. So I'm just responding to what Sam was saying on the chat there, about how financially decarbonising at this stage is a really positive kind of goal, and also talking about how, as sport, as a wider message, what it can start to say. So what works really well is when large organisations and groups, both big and small, come together to do something like a statement saying, we're choosing to decarbonise because of da 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 da. For example, so big groups and small groups can come together and say, we're going to do this as part of the COVID narrative, but then also beyond that as well. So kind of saying that becomes the narrative, because I think what this crisis is showing people is that how everything is connected: jobs, sport, creativity, you know, how the nation has really kind of brought the best out of everybody, but then also, you know, how people need to rely on each other. So things like that, basically, like coming together for one big message to say, we're choosing to do this because of, etc. That makes sense.
Does. Thank you, Zena. And I had a look at the cricket club after last week. I think it's absolutely brilliant.
Great, thanks.
I agree with you, and I think there's an element here that we need to kind of build on and accelerate some of the things that were already happening. So if you look back a couple of years to when Lord's Cricket Ground, MCC, where Russ from, switched to 100% renewable and then to 100% powered by wind, that was very clearly linked to the reasons why, to the motivator, which was, you know, yeah, partly this is going to save money over the long term, but mainly it's the right thing to do in the context of climate change. I think if you're looking at Formula One recently came out and said we'll be carbon neutral as a sport by 2030 and linked that very strongly to climate change. And I think accepted that as a very carbon intensive sport, there was an extra responsibility there, which I thought was a positive step. We look at an initiative from the RNA called Golf Course 2030. That's about being able to manage resources and keep the game of golf thriving in an environment where there is pressure on the game and pressure on resources because of climate change, and very specific ways in which climate change will affect the sport. So I think there are things that are out there. There are things that there are really good examples of kind of positive communications from organisations in sport who've taken a big step. But I think they are, at the moment, still relatively isolated examples. And I think the more that we can build you know, a momentum around it, and almost like an expectation that if you are active on this scale, then you need to be active on sustainability, then we'll really be getting somewhere.
Yeah, agree. And I was looking forward to coming and speaking to the Extinction Rebellion Cricket Club before all this kicked off. So we will do that at some point in the future. We're certainly looking forward to that. And I think in terms of the messaging, sometimes when venues have gone to 100% renewable, made great announcements around reducing carbon footprint, they've not always gone down the route of explaining the reasons why. It's been clear that there is a benefit, but there's not always been kind of explicit support around the climate message and really driving that home. So I think there is a huge opportunity there if anybody's going to take that big step. Jade, you've had your hand up. Please, if you'd like to unmute and come into the discussion as well.
Yeah, hi guys. Good afternoon. I'm Jade from NG. So I think just to touch on some sort of positives there from the way that this particular sector is progressing with encouraging more to uptake in leisure activities. So there's been a recent survey by Active Leisure, which reached out to a number of different providers of leisure across whether that's local authorities, sports clubs, or private facilities as well. So 87% of the existing membership base for those facilities said that they will continue to use those facilities moving forwards, but actually what they'd like to look at is more of a hybrid model, where there's more options for things at home as well as going actually to use the facility. That may be a way that venues and other clubs are looking moving forwards. Actually, is there more of a hybrid model? You'll have seen a lot of stars and clubs doing online workout videos, that kind of thing. So it's going to become more of a hybrid model between the two moving forwards. Interestingly, 32% of people that weren't actively engaged with clubs as well are saying that they actually want to uptake more in the use of facilities moving forwards, and actually that this particular period has enlightened them in terms of what the actual physical activity can do. And I think there's been some great initiatives out there, sort of sustainable communications from the likes of big iconic brands like Joe Wicks, but also local clubs. So like Barnes Rugby Club, you may have seen the Big Lift Challenge. That has just gone huge in a very short space of time, backed by a number of sort of sports players in those teams that have actually sent the message across communication channels. And actually the uplift on those particular activities has sort of made sure that everyone's connected with their existing club that they're a member of, but also widen that particular reach as well beyond the Barnes Leisure Club facility itself. I suppose just touching on some stuff that Pete mentioned earlier about actually using this as an ideal opportunity for venues and clubs to actually benchmark data potentially. So easiest way, obviously, looking at your meter readings, half-hourly data, etc., understanding if there's still plant that's running behind the scenes at the moment that potentially if the venue shouldn't be, so some quick wins there. But what we're actually seeing is that a lot of venues are looking at how they could become multi-use above and beyond just being a venue for people to come and play sport at regularly. Actually, venues in itself, particularly arenas, stadiums, are obviously trying to reach out to new artists to come and perform at their venues. They're actually now demanding that they're only going to perform at zero carbon venues. So actually there's quite a big demand in the existing ones, but also the new buildings that are being built. Actually, how can you get to zero carbon? And whilst now is a challenging time, it does present a really good opportunity for existing clubs, new buildings, etc., to actually plan out what that may look like and how that can be achievable. So I think there's some really good opportunities, and I mean, NG have been working with heritage buildings, venues, stadiums, etc., to map out that journey. And I think you'll find moving forwards that there'll be a lot more facilities that are actually trying to find multi-use. Actually, can you open up the door just other than for sport moving forwards, because you'll need to look at ways to drive revenue into those businesses above and beyond what they're currently doing. But I think all in all, quite a positive message about how potentially even the mental health side of things at the moment. I think if anything, you might see the use of sport and leisure become even more prominent moving forwards as a result of the challenges on the mental health of the population moving forwards. I certainly think you'll see a lot more doctor referrals moving forwards as well. But that's it from me. Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Jade. Yeah, lots of good points. Lots of good points making there. we are at 3 o'clock, ladies and gents. So we're coming towards the end of it. If anybody's got any final comments, please add them onto the chat or any questions. I'm aware that there's been an active conversation with some people getting good responses to their own questions. We're certainly going to pull everything together. We'll create a summary and we'll try and address some of these questions moving forward next week. Dom, would you like to just sort of wind up and make a few closing comments at this point?
I'm happy to. I haven't got anything massive to add. I think first of all, say thank you for everybody for coming to share some of your time with us. Like we say, really encouraged by not just the size of the response to these webinars, but the quality of the conversation and how lively the discussions are. We are committed to keeping these going for as long as the appetite is there. Hopefully that will be for a long time. We're committed to turning these webinars, the points that have been made, the questions that have been raised into kind of work and content that will be genuinely useful to you in whichever part of sport you work. So we'll be sending summaries round of each conversation within a day or two of them happening. We'll be playing some of these debates out increasingly on social media, and ultimately in the next few weeks we're going to be coming up with a guide or a thought piece about how sport can come back better, stronger, more sustainable in every way, but particularly in an environmental sense from this crisis. Ultimately, BASIS is a community of people and organisations who love sport and who care about the planet, and it's always going to be led and driven by the network, by the community. So keep your feedback coming. If you've got thoughts about how we can focus these webinars in a way that works for you, then we'd love to hear them. Contact info@basis.org.uk. Over the next few weeks, we're going to have quite a varied programme. We're going to have a few speakers as well, guest speakers like Lord Deben, who's chair of the Climate Change Committee, really interesting speaker. But yeah, just to say a big thank you, and I hope you all stay safe and stay well, and hopefully soon we'll be able to move forward as a community.
Lovely, thanks, Dom. And I just want to say a quick farewell. A quick thank you to everybody who participated, the participation on the chat as well. Important question just came up from Sam asking about a forum for this conversation to continue beyond this meeting. So just to reiterate what Dom said, a formal way of getting in touch with us is the info@basis.org.uk email address. We are in the process of updating the website and making it more user-friendly. So there will be user forums on there. They're not quite ready yet. That's in the process. But we do have a LinkedIn group. So if you look for BASIS on LinkedIn, please feel free to post on there. But we're a friendly community. Look, all of you guys joining us. I think we had in excess of well over 70. I think we peaked 80 people on this call today. So there's a passion, there's a desire, there's an interest amongst the sports community to actually take this forward. Take this terrible situation and turn it into an opportunity. That's certainly what we want to do with BASIS. We want to support all of you in what you're doing, and we hope that you will reciprocate and give us some of your support as well, and continue to participate in these discussions. So please let your colleagues know if this was an interesting and enjoyable conversation. That's what it's intended to be. We want everybody to interact on these. We want it to be a positive experience. We did actually have a wonderful email come in last week, and essentially somebody said they felt at home in this conversation, and it infused them, and they realise that there are other people out there that care about these issues and see the positives that are coming out of this crazy situation that we're in at the moment. So we hope that you felt at home. We hope that you will join us next week. Do look out for the next invite in your inbox over the coming days. Thank you for giving us an hour of your time. We hope it's valuable, and we will see you all next week. Thank you very much.